All right, back with another reading hour here. Let me make sure I got my audio set up correctly. Seems like it is. Give the Instagram a second to catch up here, and then we shall get started. All right, looks like we're good on the Instagram, and I got my TikTok back. I can now stream again on True Crimes of the Empire on the TikTok. So let's pick back up here with the Gladio document. So let's see. We had left off talking about more of the financial misdeeds between the Vatican and the mafia. So this next section here is called Damning Evidence. But the Italian police investigators were neither completely corrupt nor totally incompetent. It's bad news for the mafia. Months after the Piazza Fontana bombing, Ordine Nuovo (ON), the New Order, a neo-fascist organization founded by Pino Rauti, came under suspicion. On March 3rd, 1972, Giovanni Ventura, Franco Freda, and Rauti were arrested and charged with planning the terrorist attack. So this is we must have talked about the Piazza Fontana bombing earlier. But again, just to refresh everyone, part of Operation Gladio, like I would say maybe a majority of Operation Gladio, involved conducting a bunch of terrorist attacks uh, by like using far right militants, often like quite literally leftover Nazis from World War II, to conduct these far right terrorist attacks on innocent civilians, and then use the media control that they had and the leverage they had over politicians uh, to frame the left for all of it. So that's typically what was done. Let's see if just making sure I'm coming through here. All right, yeah, that looks good. Okay, cool. Sorry, you guys. The evidence against them was compelling. The composition of the bombs used in Piazza Fontana was identical to the explosives that Ventura hid in a friend's home a few days after the incident. The bags in which the bombs were concealed had been purchased a couple of days before the attacks in a shop in Padua, Freda's hometown. Freda's hometown. Maybe it's Padua instead of Padua. Despite such findings, the three men were acquitted. So, like, pretty obvious evidence that these guys did it, but they're acquitted anyway. So, again, giving you evidence of the level of corruption and leverage that Gladio had. During the trial, alarming claims were made. Ventura told the court that he was an agent of the CIA. In support of the claim, he directed court officials to a safety deposit box he had opened at Banca Popolare in the names of his mother and aunt. Within the box were confidential CIA files. One document, dated May 4th, 1969, listed a number of detailed steps to be taken, including, quote, a possible wave of terror attacks to convince public opinion of the dangers of maintaining the government's alliance with the left. When asked if he had been manipulated by the CIA or an outside intelligence agency, Franco Freda said, quote, the life of everyone is manipulated by those with more power. In my case, I accept that I have been a puppet in the hands of an idea, but not the hands of men in the secret services here in Italy or abroad. That is to say, I have voluntarily fought my own war, following the strategic design from my ideas. That is all. So it also makes you wonder, how does he get a hold of these CIA documents unless he's an arm of this, like an asset of the CIA? But also, it's very convenient for him to have this kind of testimony that does not implicate the CIA or any other intelligence agencies whatsoever, and it makes it seem like he's just some kind of lone wolf who got a hold of these materials in some unknown way. Very convenient. So this next section here is sworn testimony. 30 years after the Piazza Fontana massacre, during the trial of three other ON operatives, General Giandelio Maletti, former head of Italian counterintelligence, said that the massacre had been carried out by the Italian stay-behind army and right-wing terrorists on the orders of the CIA. In his sworn testimony, Maletti told the court, quote, the CIA, following the directives of its government, wanted to create an Italian nationalism capable of holding what it saw as a slide to the left, and for this purpose, it may have made use of right-wing terrorism. He added, quote, don't forget that Nixon was in charge, and Nixon was a strange man, a very intelligent politician, but a man of rather unorthodox initiatives. Similarly, Paolo Emilio Taviani, the Christian Democrat in Italy, told investigators that the Italian military intelligence service was about to send a senior officer from Rome to Milan to prevent the bombing, but decided to send a different officer from Padua in order to put the blame on left-wing anarchists. In an August 2000 interview for Il Secolo, uh, what's XIX? 19 for Secolo 19 newspaper, Taviani said, quote, "It seems to me certain, however, that agents of the CIA were among those who supplied the materials and who muddied the waters of the investigation." Yeah, so you're seeing a recurring pattern here. Um, Very obvious terrorism stoked by the intelligence agencies, using agents of the far right, blaming it on the far left, and then when there is an investigation, if there ever is, they muddy the waters, prevent it from condemning the right people, and let alone finding out anything more about the deeper structure at hand there. So this next section here is the American commander. In the course of the 30-year investigation, Italian officials were able to put into place the key planners of the Piazza Fontana bombing. Hung Fendwich, a leading engineer for Selenia, oversaw the proliferation of attacks and coup preparations. Selenia, with offices in Rome, specialized in electronic security and defense. The company was owned by Finmeccanica, a conglomerate with a long history of ties to the CIA. Fendwich was a typical eminence grise. He studied and refined plans, drew up analyses of the political situation, and left the dirty work of execution to the ON and other neo-fascist groups in service of the agency. The bombing was allegedly commandeered by Navy Captain David Carrot, a CIA operative attached to the NATO command in Verona. Carrot worked in tandem with Gladio commander Sergio Minetto and Carlo Di Giulio, the CIA mole within Ordine Nuovo. Preparations for the bombing had been made at an isolated house near Treviso. Okay. And again, this is like a level of detail that you don't get from conspiracy theorists. When they just talk about whatever crazy theories they have, like the people who are on the far right usually, they just will point out such and such person and say, look, this person has ties to this agency, and then this person has ties to that person. And then they leave all the connections up to you to pretty much make up out of thin air. Like, they don't usually draw this level of connection. They don't have times and dates of specific events like this and these kind of connections. And they're certainly not footnoted the way this book is footnoted. So again, when people try to draw the false equivalence between far right and far left conspiracy theories, it's like on the far left, we have fact that these agencies admitted to, and then on the far right, they have quite literal drivel and nonsense. So the next section here is the Golpe Borghese. On December 7th, 1970, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the Gladio unit launched the Golpe Borghese, or the Borghese coup, an attempt to topple the Italian government. Named after Junio Valerio Borghese, the Black Prince, the coup attempt involved hundreds of gladiators, including Gelli and Sindona, along with members of the Corpo Forestale dello Stato, Italy's state forest police. The planners intended to kidnap Italian President Giuseppe Saragat and to murder Angelo Vicari, the head of the National Police Department. At the last minute, the plans were canceled. News arrived that Saragat's Christian Democratic government knew of the plan and stood ready to declare martial law. Borghese had been busy during the Cold War. He continued to recruit former members of Decima Mas and right-wing activists, including Stefano della Chiai, for Gladio, and helped to establish Fronte Nazionale, FN, an organization designed, in the words of Borghese, quote, to subvert the institutions of the state by means of a coup. So they're just stating flat out what they intend to do, what all these orgs are for, what their plans are. He set up his military headquarters for the coup in Rome at a shipyard owned by Remo Orlandini, one of the country's leading industrialists. According to newspaper accounts, James Jesus Angleton arrived at the shipyard before the coup attempt and left as soon as the planned attack was canceled. So yeah, you have the known CIA operatives involved in this. Again, none of this conspiracy theory. This next section we have here is Borghese's farewell. Sorry, excuse me. When Borghese died in Spain in 1974, Della Chiai said the Black Prince had been poisoned because investigations into the 1970 coup had begun in Italy and too many people wanted him dead. Possible, very possible. 30 years after the Golpe Borghese, French investigative journalist René Monzon uncovered evidence that the military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Rome was intricately involved in the plot. Monzat also discovered that President Nixon had carefully monitored the preparations and remained constantly informed of the developments by the CIA, or by CIA officials. These findings were confirmed through a Freedom of Information request from La Repubblica in December 2004. Again, just showing like where the sources of all these things are. They are documents from these agencies themselves admitting this. And then journalists have to ask for FOIA requests. You don't usually see far-right conspiracy theories based on FOIA documents. It's just not how it goes down. The Peteano attack. This next section here. On May 31st, 1971, a car bomb exploded in a forest near the Italian village of Peteano. The explosion gravely wounded one and killed 3 members of the Carabinieri, Italy's paramilitary police force. The Carabinieri had been summoned to the site by an anonymous phone call. Inspecting an abandoned Fiat 500, one of the policemen opened the hood and triggered the bomb. 2 days later, another anonymous call implicated the Red Brigades, a far-left communist group that had engaged in assassinations and kidnappings. 200 communists with an affiliation to the group were rounded up and held in custody. So also note the difference in the reaction of the police when there's a terrorist attack and they find right-wingers responsible. They just get the 3 guys that they found with material, like clear as day evidence. They investigate them and then they let them go. And then when there's an attack that they can, not even credibly, but just with some kind of fictitious claim, blame on the left, they round up 200 communists and hold them in custody just to be safe. The arms dump, this next section here. The case against the brigades was eventually weakened by a discovery made near Trieste by the Carabinieri on February 24th, 1972. The Italian officers stumbled upon an underground arms dump containing automatic rifles, grenades, and composition C4, the most powerful plastic explosive in the world at that time. The officers initially thought that the cache must belong to a criminal group such as the Camorra or the Ndrangheta, if it didn't belong to the brigades. But the C4 baffled the investigators. The mafias and the brigades relied on explosives made of gelignite. C4 was an explosive that was used almost exclusively by NATO and US forces. Again, the clues just keep on coming. A week later, more arms were found in a nearby cave. This second discovery prompted General Gerardo Serravalle, the commander of Gladio and Italian military intelligence, to order the dismantling of all the arms dumps in forests, meadows, church basements, and cemeteries throughout Italy. In addition to the explosives, the dumps contained portable arms, ammunition, hand grenades, knives and daggers, 60mm mortars, several 57mm recoilless rifles, sniper rifles, radio transmitters, binoculars, and various tools. Again, footnoted here, if anybody wants to go and check up on the sources. The weapons were removed from the 137 burial sites and transported by the Secret Service plane Argo 16 to the Gladio base in Sardinia. The aircraft exploded in flight on November 23, 1973, and may have been sabotaged by aggrieved gladiators. The suspicion gained credence by the fact that Serravalle was supposed to have been a passenger on the plane. In 1990, this is crazy, just like the level of intrigue and like seemingly infighting among the Gladio operatives themselves. Interesting, you love to see that. In 1990, Serravalle told the press that he had been shocked to discover the extremist views of those in his command. Quote, "I found myself an officer in the service of the Italian Republic at the head of an armed band," he said. Also, another footnoted statement there. This next section here is called "The Caged Bird Sings." In 1984, after 12 years of intense investigation, Vincenzo Vinciguerra, a leader of the ON, was taken into custody and questioned about the Peteano incident. After confessing in court that he had planted the car bomb, Vinciguerra said, "With the massacre of Peteano, and with all those that have followed, the knowledge should by now be clear that there existed a real live structure, occult and hidden, with the capacity of giving a strategic direction to the outrages. It lies within the state itself. There exists in Italy a secret force parallel to the armed forces, composed of civilians and military men, in an anti-Soviet capacity, that is, to organize a resistance on Italian soil against a Russian army. A secret organization, a super organization, with a network of communications, arms and explosives, and men trained to use them. A super organization which, lacking a Soviet military invasion, which might not happen, took up the task on NATO's behalf of preventing a slip to the left in the political balance of the country. I mean, that paragraph right there is probably the best short description of the entire Gladio operation, at least in Italy. Yeah, pretty much in the whole book so far. This they did with the assistance of the official secret services and the political and military forces. Following his conviction and sentence to life in prison, Vinciguerra, in an interview with The Guardian, said, quote, "The terrorist line was followed by camouflaged people, people belonging to the security apparatus, or those linked to the state apparatus through rapport or collaboration. I say that every single outrage that followed from 1969 fitted into a single organized matrix. The Avanguardia Nazionale, like Ordine Nuovo, were being mobilized into the battle as part of an anti-communist strategy originating not with organizations deviant from the institutions of power, but from within the state itself, and specifically from within the ambit of the state's relations within the Atlantic Alliance." Yeah. So yeah, this is like, again, just to say it's all real stuff. It's a very real org that was exposed many, many times throughout its existence, and at every turn was either downplayed, outright hushed up with the media and the political apparatus, or anyone who talked about it was made to seem like a conspiracy theorist, or was killed. A lot of times they were just murdered. Hi, what's up, Shibbles? Yeah, sorry for the late start today. I had some stuff going on this morning. It's summer vacation now, so my kids are home all the time, so I don't have a regular schedule in the mornings to try and do this. I was always trying to do this before when the kids were not home. It's usually quieter in the house. So this next section here is the Brescia blast. Despite the setbacks, including the discovery of the arms dump, the attacks continued. On May 28, 1974, a bomb exploded within a garbage container that had been placed in the midst of Piazza della Loggia in Brescia. So yeah, the Brescia bombing is another. I'm pretty sure like Matt Christman also talked about that on his one inebriated past episode of Chapo Trap House, where he talked about Gladio. Again, that was my introduction to the entire Gladio scandal. Was Matt Christman's inebriated past episode on Chapo, one of the very early ones. I'm sure you can find it on any of the platforms or YouTube. So let's see. The incident took place during a demonstration against the Movimento di Azione Rivoluzionaria, or MAR, yet another neo-fascist group. Okay, so it was a demonstration against a neo-fascist group, one of the many that they had, and it was bombed. So 3 weeks before the bombing, Carlo Fumagalli, a CIA operative and the founder of MAR, had been arrested for starting a fire at the Pirelli Bicocca tarpaulin depot. So a whole depot of just tarps, and somebody starts a fire there. That probably burns really badly. Bunch of plastic. The damage was estimated at 1,000 million lira at the time, and a 30-year-old worker lost his life in the blaze. 1,000 million. That just means a billion, right? So the damage was estimated at 1 billion lira at the time, and a 30-year-old worker lost his life in the blaze. Years later, Gaetano Orlando, an MAR spokesman, admitted, quote, "The MAR's group plan was that the attack should be put down to the Red Brigades, which were on the rise at the time." Brescia, where the bombing took place, was the town in which Fumagalli and the MAR had established their headquarters. The Brescia blast killed 8 people and wounded 100 more. The attack, it was later learned, had been led by Pino Rauti, the founder of the ON, who had been receiving regular paychecks from the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Again, like you have a literal paper trail. Like they didn't even pay him in cash. They signed him checks. They signed him the guy checks, and then there's still doubt that this stuff actually happened. Like people act like this is a conspiracy theory. An hour and a half after the bombing, the local police chief ordered firemen to hose down the square. This order caused, in the words of examining magistrate Domenico Vino, quote, "the possible loss of vital evidence and aroused alarming questions as to the haste of the operation." Following the attack, yeah, I mean, you should probably understand that, like, when there is a bombing, they use the dust and the remnants of the bombs to analyze the chemical makeup of them and try and determine the source. So if your police chief, the guy who's supposed to be in charge of investigating and should know things about forensic investigations, says immediately after the blast, hose down the entire square, rinse everything, wash it all, it's very suspicious. It makes the guy look like he wants to ruin the investigation. Following the attack, a series of anonymous callers to the police and the press attempted to implicate Lotta Continua, Continuous Struggle, a militant communist organization, in the incident. Members of the group were rounded up and placed in custody, only to be acquitted due to lack of evidence. Also cool that they just have no good evidence because the guy says, let's wash down the entire scene. All right, so I'm just at 20 minutes here, so I will bookmark the Gladio book, and next time, by tomorrow, we will pick up on the next section, which is Terror on a Train. Interesting. It'll be about the Italicus Rome-Munich Express, a train bombing. So now we'll switch over to the Western Marxism book. Once again, this is Western Marxism by Domenico Lacerdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So we're comparing the Eastern and Western versions of Marxism, the Eastern being the successful militant kind and Western Marxism being the performative, academic, loser kind. The storm broke instead in the West and hit Marxists and communists hard, particularly in the North American Republic, where there was perhaps the most important section of the Fourth International, founded recently by Trotsky, gross, and in this section, among the white activists, indignation knew no limits. The two countries that had signed the villainous pact must be put on the same level. They had come to an understanding because they both personified the horror of totalitarianism, in quotes. Now this category, totally separated from the colonial question, included in its condemnation, on the one hand, the country that from the moment of its founding in the October Revolution had called on the, quote, slaves of the colonies to break their chains, and on the other, the country that intended to take over and radicalize the colonial tradition, making it work in Eastern Europe as well, and even reestablishing slavery. So this is a great point. Like, that was the function of the Fourth International. All of the ultra leftists, all the people who claim to oppose actually existing socialism from the left, are a result of this like Trotskyist split from Eastern successful Marxism. This is like probably one of the founding moments of the creation of the Western joke Marxism, where they make this false equivalence between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and say that they're both just equally totalitarian, even though one literally seeks to free the working masses and the other seeks to further enslave them and codify that slavery and make it official. Influenced by this climate, Trotsky resorted to using the category, quote, totalitarian dictatorship, and put into the genus of this category the species Stalinist and fascist and Hitlerian, a usage that would become the common sense of the Cold War and the dominant ideology of today. And yet this was not enough to avoid a devastating rift in the U.S. Trotskyist party. That's what they do best, is split up. They are wreckers at heart. That's like their whole thing. The dissidents demanded that the Soviet Union be condemned as imperialist and co-responsible for the outbreak of the war on a par with Nazi Germany. On this point as well, the conflict between Western and Eastern Marxism emerged. Did the Second World War start on September 1st, 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland? Even if we want to remain focused only on Europe, why not add the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the Italian-German intervention against the Spanish Republic, which had been supported by the Soviet Union, but not by Great Britain and France? Above all, why ignore what was happening in Asia? In May 1938, Mao took stock of the situation. Quote, by now, 1/3 of the world's population has entered the war. Look, Italy, then Japan, Abyssinia, then Spain, and then China. The population of the countries at war now amounts to almost 600 million, or nearly 1/3 of the world's total population. After attacking Abyssinia, Italy attacked Spain and Germany joined in. Then Japan attacked China. What will come next? Undoubtedly, Hitler will fight the great powers. Indeed, the war had already begun and was aimed above all at the colonial peoples. Stalin shared this vision, quote, a new imperialist war is already in its second year, a war waged over our huge territory, stretching from Shanghai to Gibraltar and involving over 500 million people. The map of Europe, Africa, and Asia is being forcibly redrawn. From China's point of view, it was difficult to consider 1937, a year that brought the rape of Nanking by Japanese imperialism, with the massacre of 200,000 to 300,000 people, a period of peace. Oh, yes, it was difficult to consider 1937 a period of peace. So, yeah, that's the case for placing the start of World War II in 1937 rather than 1939. Oh, Shibbles, I appreciate it. Shibbles is clarifying he wasn't complaining that I was late. He just feels bad if he's like missing on some stuff. I mean, they're all up on the YouTube, and I will start putting this out on the podcast audio feed in another couple of days. Where did I leave off? Okay, so far from sharing in the indignation of American Trotskyists and Western Marxists in general, the Chinese Communist leader expressed satisfaction over the Non-Aggression Pact. It constitutes a great blow to Japan and a great help to China, since it will enable the Soviet Union to increase rather than decrease its aid to China by freeing it for some time from the threat of the Third Reich and from the danger of fighting on two fronts to support China's resistance to Japanese aggression. The Chinese Communist leader was focused on the pro-slavery war of colonial subjection against his country, unleashed by the Empire of the Rising Sun, a war largely ignored by Western Marxism. Yeah, I literally have had people ask me like, "Well, what was China's role in World War II? Like, you should look into that." It's like they were doing the same thing. They were allied with the Allies. They were doing more than most of the Allied nations were. They were fighting Japan almost single-handedly for a majority of it. Like, Westerners are completely ignorant about this stuff. To conclude, the great historical crisis of the first half of the 20th century, which we have defined as the Second 30 Years' War, caused both at its start and at its end a bifurcation between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. At its start, Ho Chi Minh emphasized that the tragedy and horror had already begun to rage well before 1914 for the colonial peoples. Lenin called attention to the fact that the First World War was, in reality, the intersection of two wars, one raging in Europe among the slave owners, and another unleashed by the slave owners to round up slaves and cannon fodder in their colonies. The final stage of the Second 30 Years' War saw Western Marxism date the Second World War from its start in Europe rather than in the colonies, particularly in China. In any case, the defeat inflicted on Germany, Japan, and Italy flowed into the world anti-colonialist revolution, which would spread worldwide in the second half of the 20th century. Yeah, and I think that's probably part of what gave people this amount of false hope. Like, I don't want to put it in Star Wars terms, but it's like there was this period of decades where all these countries were gaining independence from Great Britain. Everybody knows that like the UK has like created more independence days around the world than any other empire. And so maybe there was this like collective idea that that would continue well on into the 90s after the Cold War and everything. But this would be the Empire Strikes Back period. If that period was the New Hope, this is when the empire has absolutely tightened its grip. Neocolonialism is like pretty firmly entrenched, and there just is no internationalist workers' movement that is fighting that in any way. It is quite literally only the anti-imperialist BRICS alliance and the Axis of Resistance that is doing anything to materially resist that neocolonialism. I simply cannot take the Western left any more seriously than I take the Zionist or Israeli left. Like, they do not exist. So now we're on to part 3, Western Marxism and the Anti-Colonial Revolution, a meeting that didn't happen. In part 1, the Bobbio-Togliatti debate in the year of Dien Bien Phu. For some time, thanks to the enormous prestige gained by the Soviet Union in the wake of Stalingrad and the powerful echoes sounding throughout Asia and around the world from the victory of the anti-colonialist revolution and of the Communist Party in China, the latent tensions between the two Marxisms seemed to be a chapter in history now concluded. But this was only in appearance, as is demonstrated by the debate in Italy in 1954 among Norberto Bobbio, who was on the verge of becoming a world-famous philosopher, Galvano della Volpe, at the time the most illustrious philosopher of Marxism and Italian communism, and Palmiro Togliatti, General Secretary of the Communist Party and one of the principal leaders of the international communist movement. I feel like I've heard Palmiro Togliatti mentioned in the Gladio book. I wonder if he gets assassinated and I'm just forgetting. It was the first who initiated the debate. Bobbio recalls that in the years of the resistance and in those immediately following, he was, quote, one of those who believed in the by now irresistible force of the Communist Party. And he adds, in the irresistible force of the revolutionary wave that continued to grow. Quote, we left decadentism behind us. It was the ideological expression of a class in decline. We had abandoned it because we participate in the birth and the hopes of a new class. I am convinced that if we have not learned from Marxism to see history from the point of view of the oppressed, gaining a new and immense perspective on the human world, we will not be saved. Either we will have sought refuge on the island of inferiority or of interiority, or we will have put ourselves at the service of the old masters. As a higher expression and more mature expression of modernity, Marxism here is not the thought of a single author so much as, quote, the starting point of a movement of social revolution that is still ongoing, and which seems unstoppable. It is not possible, quote, to turn history back toward the past. Whoever wants to reject Marxism wholesale knows they are preparing a quixotic effort. They must retrace the journey of 4 centuries and hurl themselves back into the Middle Ages. Beyond Marxism itself, Bobbio's judgment on the revolution it has inspired is positive. The October Revolution led to a radical, quote, transformation of the economically and socially backward feudal world. It brought forth, quote, a tumultuous and subversive wave that sooner or later would be uncorked and channeled into a more regular course. Indeed, we are in the presence, quote, of totalitarian regimes, but that was not cause for shock because these were a, quote, hard historical necessity, serious in the present, but fated to be superseded. That's a great point too. Like that is pretty much how I think of all the capitalist regimes that exist today. Is that they are very serious. They do have dire consequences because they are still murdering mass amounts of people every single day. But they are part of the old way of doing things, and they are becoming outmoded. It really is like the Gramsci quote: like the old world is dying, the new one is struggling to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And it can stay like that for as long as many people are alive. It can stay like that for entire generations if people don't act accordingly to create that new world. It is only done by human action. Let's see. Chibble says Ho Chi Minh always showing up in history around revolution. Yeah, the guy was like always in the best places at the right time. The praise of Marxism and communism was not addressed exclusively to the unresolved social question in the capitalist metropoles. Quote, Western civilization itself is put into question. Thanks to its, quote, technological success, it, quote, arrogates to itself the right to be the only possible form of civilization, and to consider, therefore, the course of human history as its exclusive prerogative. It was time to put an end to the philosophy of history that had overseen the colonial expansion of the capitalist West. Quote, history has only one direction, that is, the direction followed by the white civilization, on the margins of which lie only petrification, arrested development, barbarism, that there is not only one civilization worthy of the name, and that this one is the only one called on to exercise exclusive dominion, is the implicit assumption and the explicit consequence of the colonial expansion of the last 4 centuries that has not known any other form of contact with the other civilizations than to exterminate them in America, to enslave them in Africa, and to exploit them economically in Asia. Man, that is another fire paragraph. Another thing that just describes in like 3 sentences the entire 400 to 500 year span of colonial history. We come to the debate of 1954. On the socialist states, the philosopher from Turin was somewhat more reserved. To their credit was having, quote, initiated a new phase of civil progress in politically backward countries, introducing traditionally democratic institutions of formal democracy such as universal suffrage and elective offices, and of substantial democracy such as the collectivization of the forces of production. The new, quote, socialist state had to take to heart the mechanisms of liberal guarantees, pouring, quote, a drop of oil in the machine of the revolution already accomplished. So far, this was a position that, with good reason, insisted on the essential character of, quote, formal freedom and its juridical institutional embodiment. Unfortunately, the Turin philosopher identified the cause of, quote, formal freedom with the liberal capitalist West, separating it from the colonial question. Yeah, that is a common move that basically all Western Marxists, Western philosophers, Western thinkers in the left tradition, who claim to be at least, it's what they do. Like they do the same thing as like the Greek philosophers. They talk about democracy and freedom, and they just ignore this entire class of slaves that props up that entire thing. That's what happens when you talk about liberation ideology and you don't center colonialism and neocolonialism. On May 7th, 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, a popular army led by the Communist Party put an end to the French colonial domination of Indochina and to the terror and infamy connected to it, which had already been forcefully denounced, as we have seen, by Ho Chi Minh. On the eve of the battle, the U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles asked the French Prime Minister Georges Bidault, quote, "And if we gave you 2 atomic bombs?" To use immediately, he meant. In this same period, just to give another example, Great Britain responded to the challenge to its colonial dominion in Kenya by enclosing the civilian population in this country in terrible concentration camps in which the mass death of women and children was the norm. Yeah, just barbaric, absolute inhuman people, the colonizers. They're just the worst. One understands, therefore, the position of Palmiro Togliatti, the secretary of the Italian Communist Party. Quote, "When were these liberal principles on which the British state of the 19th century is said to have been based a model, I believe, for those who think like Bobbio, ever applied to the colonial peoples? The truth is that the quote liberal doctrine is founded on a barbaric discrimination between human creatures. Beyond that of the colonies, such discrimination rages in the very capitalist metropoles themselves, as is demonstrated by the case of American blacks, quote, for the most part deprived of elementary rights, discriminated against, and persecuted." Yeah, and again, remember, like, lynchings are not that far off. Lynchings are something that happened in the past century. It was a common thing. The entire white community would come out and treat this like an event, and they would torture and murder a black man in front of everyone. And that was just a legal thing that happened. The Communist Party leader did not show any disdain for, quote, formal freedom. Of course, its realization cannot be heedless of the international situation, geopolitical context, or the terrible threats that weigh on the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries. But notwithstanding the need to take into account the Cold War that, as the conversation between Dulles and Bidault demonstrates, was always on the verge of transforming itself into a nuclear holocaust, there was no doubt that freedom, mistakenly considered formal only by vulgar Marxism, was in fact essential in and of itself. Quote, "The liberal and democratic upheavals have made clear a progressive tendency, of which the declarations of the rights of liberty are a part as much as are those of the new social rights. Rights of liberty and social rights have become and are the patrimony of this movement. Together with, quote, social rights, it is also and especially the demand for quote, rights of liberty for the colonial peoples and those of colonial origin that constitutes the dividing line between the socialist and communist movements on the one hand and Western liberalism on the other." Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of distinctions between actual Marxism and Western liberalism, but none of those distinctions seem to matter to the Western quote unquote progressives and leftists who think that they are Marxists but are actually liberals in praxis, or in praxis, really. Have you ever noticed that if you just like define things for what they are, if you tell a Western Marxist that the things that they are doing are actually liberal praxis and are not Marxist praxis, that they don't change their mind and therefore what they are doing, they just get mad. They just call you a Fed, they call you a wrecker, they say that you're dividing the left, which they are not a part of. There is no self-awareness. This next section here is number 2, Marx cut in half by Della Volpe and Coletti. Della Volpe, considered the most illustrious Italian Marxist philosopher of the time, intervened in the debate opened by Bobbio before Togliatti. One thing leaps out immediately: the difference in the positions of the great intellectual and those of the secretary of his party. Unlike the latter, the former made no mention of the colonial question, nor of the permanent state of exception imposed on the agents of revolutions looked on with hostility by the liberal West. Della Volpe instead followed a different strategy, concentrating on the celebration of libertas maior, the concrete development of individuality guaranteed by the material conditions of life and made possible by socialism. So focusing on individual freedom, but only as far as it's made possible by the state of socialism. By doing so, on the one hand, he devalued the juridical guarantees of freedom by the liberal state, which he now happily demoted to, quote, libertas minor, or minor. Okay, so I guess that was a typo when it was like major. It must have been major. So libertas major and libertas minor are the Latin. On the other hand, he ended up confirming the transfiguration by which Bobbio made the liberal tradition into the champion of the cause of universal enjoyment of civil rights, formal freedoms, of the libertas minor, of limitations on state power. Bobbio had called for studying and, quote, understanding liberalism by going to the school of Locke and Montesquieu and the Federalist Papers. Colonial questions and histories were eliminated. Beyond being a shareholder in the Royal African Company, the society that organized the African slave trade, Locke was, as noted by the illustrious historian of the institution of slavery, David Bryan Davis, quote, the last great philosopher who sought to justify absolute and perpetual slavery. As for Montesquieu, he had called for taking note of the, quote, uselessness of slavery among us in our climes, and therefore wanted, quote, to limit natural servitude, servitude naturelle, to certain countries. Finally, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, Madison, was himself a slave owner. So again, at the heart of all of the Western ideas of liberty are these people who own slaves, are these wealthy, privileged, white, land and slave owning men who base their entire philosophy on those a prioris that you can have freedom and democracy while ignoring an entire class of other people who prop that up and make it possible for your privilege and comfort. The authors Bobbio regarded as teachers were the embodiment of the, quote, barbaric discrimination between human creatures that Togliatti charged liberalism with. John Stuart Mill's Hymn to Liberty in his most celebrated text, On Liberty, was particularly important to the philosopher from Turin. And yet, in this essay, the English liberal justifies the, quote, despotism of the West over the still juvenile races, kept in a state of implicit obedience so that they can be set on the path of progress. Yeah, I mean, that's literally the racist, the white supremacist notion of having to civilize these backward colored people. In the 1950s, the quote, despotism and the implicit obedience imposed by the West were felt in Indochina, in Africa, and throughout the colonial world. In the United States itself, at least in the South, blacks were exposed to the violence of both the local police of racist and fascist bands, encouraged and tolerated by the authorities. And overwhelmed by the celebration of Libertas Major, Della Volpe remained unconcerned or was unable to highlight Bobbio's glaring injuries. Unfortunately, Della Volpe was giving lessons. His disciples also distinguished themselves by their scarce attention to the colonial question. One thinks of Lucio Coletti. In his Marxist period, he demonstrated the underlying limits of the freedom so dear to the liberal capitalist world, referring to the, quote, workhouses or the houses of correction, where, often on the simple word of the police, the unemployed and the poor, all those considered suspect of being idle vagabonds, were incarcerated, and defining them as, quote, concentration camps of the enlightened bourgeoisie. The argument was fitting, a shame that it was partially undermined by the actual concentration camps of the enlightened bourgeoisie reserved for the barbarians in the colonies. Yeah, people will often like make this connection and say that there's like slavery within the imperial core, and they'll point out things like the 13th Amendment, the prison labor, sweatshop labor in other countries and everything, and then still will not make the connection that they should condemn Western liberalism or that like it's just as bad as fascism. And I've been saying since the beginning of the genocide, like there is no metric which you could honestly say the U.S. is not fascist yet. And that also implicates all the American citizens who are going along with it and pretending that they are fighting the fascism while living comfortably under it and continuing to fund it with their taxes and their labor. All right. Okay, so tomorrow we will pick up right here. I'm going to bookmark this one. And now we'll switch over to the Peter Dale Scott book. This is Drugs, Oil, and War. Again, similar vein of the Gladio book. So in the past, the U.S. government has been the chief force, it's tough to say that, chief force preventing this understanding. This understanding would mean something in the previous paragraph. I'll just read the previous paragraph, sorry. Vietnam, in other words, was not an isolated event. It was a product of ongoing war-creating energies located chiefly in this country, which to this day have not yet been properly identified and countered. Of these forces, none is deeper and more mysterious than the involvement yet again of the CIA and the airlines working for it, with major drug traffickers not in Indochina this time, but in Colombia and Afghanistan. Such forces will continue to haunt us until they are better understood. Yeah, so that's what I left off on last time. In the past, the U.S. government has been the chief force preventing this understanding. Throughout the 1950s, Reverse propaganda concealed the KMT's active role in smuggling drugs to the United States. The principal source was Harry Anslinger, the head of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who charged repeatedly and falsely that the United States was being inundated by Communist China with a flood of Yunnan opium. Okay, so just think about that for a second. You have Harry Anslinger, who even like Joe Rogan would constantly bring up as one of the chief people who started the war on drugs, made sure that like weed was illegal because that was like one of Rogan's cause celebs in the beginning. Um, so yeah, you cannot get much more hypocritical than that. Having the head of the Bureau of Narcotics involved in the smuggling of drugs and then blaming China for that, blaming Communist China while he is helping the anti-communist holdouts on the island of Taiwan to engage in the actual trafficking, to fund their illegal operations to fight the Communist China. But he was backed by a powerful China lobby inside and outside the government, powerful enough to suppress the only book in that period which referred to the KMT role in drug trafficking. The U.S. government had persisted in this practice of projective or reverse drug propaganda, blaming communists for drug trafficking that is in fact conducted by covert allies. In the 1980s, Reagan blamed Sandinistas for the cocaine flood that in fact was being principally attributed by DEA to traffickers who were Contras. Yeah, that's perfectly fitting. Reagan, doing the Iran-Contra affair that we all know is the case now, blamed it on the Sandinistas, who they were using the illegal drug money to fight. In the 1990s, Clinton's drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, attributed to, quote, narco guerrillas the flood of cocaine that in fact was principally attributed by the Colombian government to the right-wing paramilitaries. So, in case the pattern isn't clear enough, clearly the prodigious task of stopping new Vietnam wars in Colombia or Afghanistan will require a better understanding of the global drug traffic as well as its links to oil companies and other economic interests. And to this goal I dedicate this book. Assuredly, it is not definitive, but it is focused on deep political issues that other books, more sophisticated in their own way, tend to ignore. So there's a whole notes section here. I guess these are all footnotes from the previous thing that I just read, because I think I've still only gotten through the introduction so far. Very interesting. Okay. Wow, there's a lot of footnotes. I'm up to 57 so far. 74 footnotes just for the introduction. Okay, so now I guess we're getting into the book proper. We're now on page 43 of 76. So, oil, drugs, and American Third World interventions. In the half century since the Korean War, the United States has been involved in 4 major wars in the Third World. In Vietnam from 1961 to 75, in the Persian Gulf from 1990 to 91, in Colombia 1991 to present, and in Afghanistan 2001 to 2002. All 4 wars were fought in or near significant oil-producing areas. All 4 involved reliance on proxies who were also major international drug traffickers. The American habit of training, arming, and financing its drug trafficking allies in order to help secure oil resources abroad has been a major factor in the huge increase in global illicit drug trafficking since World War II. This pattern is further reinforced when we consider 2 of America's major indirect interventions of the same period: support for the Nicaraguan Contras 1981 to 88 and the Afghan Mujahideen 1979 to 91. The CIA contracted for Contra support in Central America with an airline owned by a ringleader of the largest cocaine network in the region. By providing funds for Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a drug trafficker selected for support by Pakistani intelligence, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI, the CIA helped propel Hekmatyar into becoming, for a while, the largest heroin trafficker in Afghanistan and perhaps the world. All empires since the Renaissance have been driven by the search for foreign resources, and nearly all, including the British, the French, and the Dutch, used drugs as a cheap way to pay for overseas expansion. When the United States decided to preserve Western influence in Southeast Asia, it inherited a social structure of former colonial regimes that had coexisted in one way or another with powerful Chinese triads engaged in the drug trafficking. Interesting. So yeah, I mean, when you read the Gladio book and this one together like we're doing here, it really does paint this whole picture of the entire Western world just built on slavery, genocide, and then this added element of drug trafficking, which people don't really take into account enough. Everybody seems to think of drugs as just this like kind of inevitable thing that is a result of like some kind of human weakness, just some inability to avoid these drugs. And it is really not taking into account the massive infrastructure that goes into maintaining that system and who benefits from that. Shibble says, it's the number one thing in changing yourself is applying self criticism. Yeah, and it also applies to entire movements. If a movement has no mechanism for self crit and improvement, you're pretty much going to be doomed to stagnate like the Western left has been doing since the end of the Black Panthers, just repeating the same mistakes over and over again and not learning anything from them. She was also said, "Wow, that doesn't at all surprise me about like the drug trafficking and the hypocrisy of these officials." Yeah, it's par for the course. We shall see in this chapter that the United States has become more and more committed to exclusive domination of the world oil economy, both to secure its increasing oil needs and to preclude this power from passing into the hands of anyone else. And we should also note that in 2025, it's been this way for I think a couple of years now. The U.S. is the number one oil exporter. Um, the U.S. produces more oil than anyone in the world, mostly because they own so many oil producing regions because of these coups, but also because of like the new developments in like shale and fracking. But I don't have the numbers in front of me. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I would just be willing to believe that it's not the shale and fracking that is really changing the tide as far as that's concerned. I feel like it's mostly due to the external properties that the U.S. owns as a result of all this imperialism. Even if they're fudging the numbers to make it seem like the U.S. is just producing most of it domestically, I just can't believe that that's actually the case. The consistent U.S. recourse to actions that have built up the global drug traffic raises an analogous question. Did the United States seek to maintain control over the global drug economy to ensure that its riches would strengthen the U.S. economy and to deny them to communist enemies? I mean, obviously, right? Seems like you got like a double. You're killing two birds with one stone here. You're like destabilizing the countries you don't want to be stable. You're bringing in all this revenue. You have all this like this entire black infrastructure, like a whole separate economy that you are running under the books, and all of it's useful in all of your aims. American dependence on drug proxies can be traced to the CIA decision in 1949 to 50 to provide arms and logistic support to the residual forces of the Chinese Kuomintang in Burma. Yeah, exactly what we're talking about in Gladio. This evolved into the much larger program of the support for opium-growing Hmong tribesmen in northeastern Laos. In the wake of the domestically unpopular Vietnam War, the United States, in asserting an increasingly explicit geostrategic interest in oil reserves throughout the world, has continued to seek out local drug proxies as a supplement or an alternative to the use of U.S. armed forces. I am not suggesting that concerns about oil and gas have dictated every U.S. policy move. On the contrary, when Clinton in 1996 was urged to recognize the Taliban by the U.S. oil company Unocal, which was eager to build a gas pipeline throughout the country, he declined to do so. Pressure from women's groups appalled by the Taliban's anti-feminist policies proved decisive. In general, oil is a major factor in explaining why the United States inclines toward intervention in the first place, not in determining just how or when the U.S. military engagement occurred in a given area. That's interesting too, to think that there were women's feminist lobbies who were able to pressure the U.S. to not get involved with the Taliban. I feel like we're just in a different place where that wouldn't be the case anymore. They would just say, they'd make some kind of statement saying, like, we see you, we hear you, but we got to make this deal with the Taliban anyway, sorry. Over the long haul since World War II, oil interests have dictated the general disposition of U.S. foreign policy. In Central Asia today, these interests transcend the issue of a single nation or pipeline. The goal is access to and control over the immense oil and gas fields of the Caspian Basin. I propose to show that this recurring convergence between oil and drugs is not a coincidence, but a feature of what I have called the deep politics of the U.S., of U.S. foreign policy, factors in policy formation that are usually repressed and not acknowledged. The role of oil in U.S. geostrategic thinking is generally acknowledged. Less recognized has been the role of drug proxies in waging and financing conflicts that would have not been adequately financed by Congress and U.S. taxpayers. Yeah, so the Gladio phenomenon. The phenomenon I am describing is sometimes characterized as blowback, the CIA's own term for unintended consequences at home of covert and usually illegal programs designed for abroad. But the term, by suggesting an accidental and lesser spin-off, misrepresents the dimensions and magnitude of the drug traffic that the United States helped relaunch after World War II. That drug traffic has multiplied and spread throughout the world like a malignant cancer. It has also branched out into other areas, notably money laundering and people smuggling, which, like the drug traffic itself, have contributed to the problem of terrorism we now face. Of course, the US reliance on drug proxies, at risks that were always clear, was motivated by the desire to secure access to natural resources in the third world, principally oil. Yeah. So again, like when you think about these huge powers, like these states, government agencies, intelligence agencies, whatever, and you see the lengths they will go to maintain their power, and you see that they not only created the demand, but the entire market and infrastructure for drug trafficking. Um, None of the stuff that they are accusing, like the Mossad, CIA, and Epstein-related, like involved actors, none of that sounds outlandish. To think that they would also then just abuse children en masse, like create a network of trafficking children for sexual exploitation, so that they could use the blackmail to manipulate powerful people in entire organizations, like even up to entire countries. None of that seems outlandish after you read this kind of stuff. I prefer to characterize what is happening by a general proposition. Covert operations, when they generate or reinforce autonomous political power, almost always outlast the specific purpose for which they were designed. Instead, they enlarge and become part of the hostile forces the United States has to address. To put it in terms I find more precise, power politics, the exercise of power by covert means, tends to metastasize into deep politics, an interplay of unacknowledged forces over which the original parapolitical agent no longer has control. The oil-drug convergence has recurred elsewhere. In 1998, the United States intervened in Kosovo on behalf of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which earlier the U.S. State Department had described as a drug-financed terrorist force. The followed talk of the Balkans as a route for Western pipeline to transport oil, or as a route for a Western pipeline to transport oil from the newly exploited oil fields of Central Asia. This followed talk of the Balkans. So yeah, I guess that was their intent. They were going to use the Balkans just to transport oil after they controlled enough of Eastern Europe. In the 1980s, the CIA helped arrange a support network for the Nicaraguan Contras with the help of a drug cartel, the Mata Ballesteros Caro Quintera Felix Gallardo cartel. My Spanish is terrible, guys, sorry. Operating through Mexico. DEA, at the same time, had identified this cartel as a major target, accounting for a major share, perhaps a third, perhaps more than half, of all the cocaine moving between Colombia and the United States. That the CIA overrode DEA's enforcement priority reflected CIA involvement with its Mexican counterpart, the DFS, and through it, with the chief Mexican drug traffickers, a powerful right-wing force in oil-rich Mexico. So yeah, the CIA overrode the DEA's enforcement priority, and that is indicative. That shows us that the CIA was in cahoots with the right-wing forces in an oil-rich area, Mexico. The clearest and most important case of consequential power politics was the decision of the United States in April and May 1979 to arm Mujahideen guerrillas in Afghanistan, one of whom, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, was already known as a drug trafficker with his own heroin refineries. In the subsequent years, opium production soared in the Afghan-Pakistan Golden Crescent. Almost no heroin from the area reached the United States before 1979, yet according to official U.S. sources, it supplied 60% of U.S. heroin by 1980. That is a hell of an explosion in business from one source. That's like insane to think about. Schiphol says, built on unethical business practices that we, the normal people, would never have the opportunity to do. Yeah, that's how people get rich. That's how people amass political power. They are freed from the regulation of normal society. This scandal was kept out of the mainstream U.S. press until the CIA support was winding down. Belatedly, in 1990, the Washington Post reported that U.S. officials had failed to investigate drug trafficking by Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, and Hekmatyar, the top CIA ISI client in Afghanistan. Quote, because U.S. narcotics policy in Afghanistan has been subordinated to the war against Soviet influence there. So again, they're just saying out loud, like, yes, we're not going to bother with the narcotics enforcement because we need the illicit flows of money because they're helping us fight the Soviets, and that is, of course, the bigger goal here. So this next section here is oil, geostrategy, and national security. American Afghanistan policy from 1979 to 91 was dominated by fear of the Iranian Revolution, which Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, feared in part as, quote, a Soviet threat to Persian Gulf oil fields. Soviet invasion a few months later aggravated this fear. Newsweek at the time wrote how, quote, control of Afghanistan would put the Russians within 350 miles of the Arabian Sea, the oil lifeline of the West and Japan. Soviet warplanes based in Afghanistan could cut the lifeline at will. Later, Brzezinski wrote how the Soviet invasion precipitated, quote, a large-scale buildup of the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf, and a commitment, quote, to the defense of the Persian Gulf region. This took the form of the Carter Doctrine of January 1980, quote, an attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America. Yeah, now this is how they talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because that's like Iran's quote unquote nuclear option. Obviously, nukes are their nuclear option, but their current nuclear option is to close off the Strait of Hormuz. And when the U.S. was bombing them last week, there was like a vote in their parliament where they agreed to do it, but then it didn't, I guess, pass the other part that would have made it actually happen. And then the whole conflict was like wrapped up before they could even get to anything like that. But that is just something that's on the table. There's like a massive amount of oil. It's like the majority of oil goes through that tiny little strait on some kind of shipping, I guess, boats with the shipping containers or however they transport it. And if Iran shuts that down, that is disastrous for cost of living in the West. Like basically prices on everything will just be exorbitant overnight. This replaced the Nixon doctrine of relying on regional superpowers to maintain order, which had collapsed in the region with the fall of the Shah of Iran to Shia fundamentalist radicals in 1979. Seen from this perspective, Brzezinski's concern about Afghanistan was rendered urgent because of the power vacuum created by the Shah's fall, after the earlier British withdrawal from the Persian Gulf in 1971. This concern is quite compatible with Brzezinski's later candid admission that he intended by meddling in Afghanistan in 1979, before Soviet invasion, precisely, quote, to induce a Soviet military intervention. And again, this is what they do. The U.S. and its power players, all of its connivers around the world, they stoke the Soviets, or in our case now, the Russians, to invade for their own existential security. And then when it actually happens the way they wanted it to happen, they point to Russia as if they are the aggressors. The more concerned one was about a Soviet push south through Iran, from a purely geographical perspective, the easier route to the Gulf. The more attractive seemed the alternative of tying the Soviets down in a mountainous and unconquerable Afghanistan. Brzezinski's ultimate motives in Afghanistan were geostrategic, to induce Soviet responses that would eventually weaken the Soviet Union and hasten its dissolution. His motives probably also included a desire to nullify the steps being taken by President Carter and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance toward détente with the Soviet Union, by signaling the SALT II arms reduction treaty 1 month earlier. By signing the SALT II. So yeah, they were trying, I guess, to make peace between the Soviet Union and the West. But in his argument for a, quote, Eurasian geostrategy, Brzezinski is quite clear that what makes the region of Central Asia, quote, geopolitically significant is above all its importance, quote, as a potential economic prize. An enormous concentration of natural gas and oil reserves is located in the region, in addition to important minerals, including gold. Brzezinski noted that these oil and gas reserves will become even more important as world demand increases by an estimated more than 50% in 20 years, quote, with the most significant increases in consumption occurring in the Far East. Many others have emphasized the strategic importance of these Central Asian energy reserves to the United States. Speaking of Azerbaijan in 1997, President Clinton said that, quote, in a world of growing energy demand, our nation cannot afford to rely on any single region for our energy supplies. By working closely with Azerbaijan to tap the Caspian's resources, we not only help Azerbaijan to prosper, we also help diversify our energy supply and strengthen our nation's security. That sounds just like every speech by a president talking about why they need to interfere in the world abroad and like the governments of other countries. It's just always that like, oh, we got to protect our interests and our resources and blah blah blah. Like, it just always sounds like that. We got to protect the stability as they're destabilizing. All right, so I'm going to bookmark it here. I'm at an hour and 4 minutes for the day. So thank you all again for joining. I'll pick this back up tomorrow. And after we get through this Peter Dale Scott book, the next one on the docket would be The Soviets Expected It. Got that one from Shibble, so thank you for the suggestion. But yeah, I'll pick it back up tomorrow. Thank you all again for joining as usual. And if you want to see the archive of all of these or check out any of them in their entirety, that is youtube.com/@TCOTEpod. That's for True